Welcome to our last video of Chapter 4 on Section 6, which will discuss the connections between cells and cellular activities. We want to describe the extracellular matrix, list examples of the ways that plant cells and animal cells communicate with adjacent cells, and summarize the roles of tight junctions, desmosomes, gap junctions, and plasmodesmata. So we'll start off with extracellular matrix. The primary components of these materials are proteins, and the most abundant protein is collagen. Yes, we have different types of collagen, but we are not going to get into that detail in this course. Instead, I want you to know that collagen fibers are interwoven with proteoglycans, which are carbohydrate-containing protein molecules. Now, something to know about our extracellular matrix is when we have a molecule out here that binds to a receptor, it's going to change the receptor's molecular structure, and the microfilament's conformation can change just inside the cell. So it can turn things off and on in DNA transcription, which is going to affect protein production. Not only do we have our extracellular matrix to hold cells together to form a tissue, but will also allow the cell within the tissue to communicate with one another. Another interesting thing is that we are going to really count on some of these extracellular structures in order to have certain processes take place in the body. So for instance, in blood clotting, when we have cells lining a blood vessel that become damaged, so let's just pretend this is a blood vessel instead of a cell, but when they become damaged, we'll start to see collagen fibers kind of poke out, and they'll display a protein receptor, which we call a tissue factor. When the tissue factor binds with another factor in the extracellular matrix, it's going to cause platelets to come and adhere or attach to the smooth muscle cells in the blood vessel to contract. And that helps to constrict the blood vessel or make it more narrow, and slows down and eventually stops the blood loss that will take place through stimulating platelets and clotting factors. So that is another way in which our extracellular matrix is playing a role in cell communication. Now let's talk about intercellular junctions. The first one to talk about is this plasmodesmata. These are the junctions we find between plant cells, and you could see that right over here between these two plant cells, and you could see that they have numerous channels that are going to pass between these adjacent plant cells and connect their cytoplasms. And this allows the plant cell to transport materials from one cell to another. Now, what we find in our animal cells are tight junctions, meaning that they have a watertight seal between our two cells. We'll also find we have special proteins called claudins and occludins that tightly hold the cells against each other, and they'll stop materials from leaking between the cells. We find this within epithelial tissues that line our internal organs and cavities and comprise most of our skin. So you can see between, let's say, these epithelial cells, we're going to have some tight junctions in here, and this is what they look like. A tight junction in our epithelial cell, like we see here, that is placed in our urinary bladder, for example, could prevent urine from leaking out into the extracellular space. So they have a very important role. The next junction is called a desmosome, and these are more like spot welds between adjacent epithelial cells in an animal cell. So they will be made up of cadherin, which are these short proteins in the plasma membrane that connect to our intermediate filaments, which we find out here and here. So they're connecting those two cells, and maintain the cells in a sheet-like formation in our organs and tissues that stretch like our skin, like our heart, and like our muscles. The last type we're going to talk about are gap junctions, and these are the ones that are the most like the plasmodesmata in our plant cells, but they are structurally different. And these junctions enable our cells, though, to communicate with one another, just like we saw with the plant cells. So we, in looking at this illustration, can see that there's almost like a little pore on the other side. So if this is one cell here, this is another cell here, and we're able to move things like ions, nutrients, and other substances back and forth between these cells. Now, we don't see it too deeply illustrated here, but this gap junction here is developed with a set of 6 proteins called connexins in the plasma membrane, and they arrange themselves in this elongated donut-like configuration, which we would call a connexon. And the connexon pores was that opening that I was discussing, allows the transport of the content between the cells. Now, one of the most important areas of our body that we have these gap junctions is within our cardiac muscle, and the electrical signal for the muscle to contract can be passed efficiently through the gap junction, allowing the heart muscle cells to contract in tandem.